They told her she didn't belong before she ever touched a rifle. 24 elite operators watched in silence as a colonel erased her name from the program with 4 words. Remove her, right now. No hearing, no test, no chance. Just a decision made by a man who looked at her and saw everything except what she actually was. What happened next stunned an entire training facility and rewrote a record that had stood untouched for 32 years. If you're new here, subscribe now. Hit that like button. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't move. This is only the beginning. The bus didn't have air conditioning. That was the first thing Maya Caldwell noticed when she boarded it at McCarran at 4 in the morning. The busted overhead vent, the recycled desert heat already pressing through the windows before the sun had even cleared the eastern ridge. 23 other candidates sat in various states of silence around her, most of them staring at their boots or their phones, trying to conserve whatever edge of mental stillness they'd brought with them. Maya sat near the back. Window seat. She'd requested it quietly, and the man beside her, thick-necked, maybe 26, Ranger tab on his duffel, had moved without a word, though not without a look. The kind of look that lasted a half-second too long and said everything without saying anything at all. She let it go. She'd been letting those looks go for 11 years. Outside, the Nevada desert scrolled past in shades of gray and pale brown, the pre-dawn sky still holding its darkness like a secret. Maya pressed 2 fingers to the glass, feeling the cold of it. She hadn't slept on the flight from Fort Bragg. Hadn't tried to. Instead, she'd spent 3 hours reviewing wind behavior charts for the high desert basin region, cross-referencing atmospheric pressure data she'd pulled from 3 different meteorological databases. The other candidates called it obsession when they found out later. She called it preparation. She was 34 years old. 2 combat deployments, 1 in Kandahar, 1 in northern Mali. 41 confirmed long-range engagements, a distinguished service commendation that her commanding officer had pushed through against bureaucratic resistance for 6 months before it finally cleared. She held a Master Marksman qualification from SOTIC, the Special Operations Target Interdiction course, which, for anyone outside the military who might not know, is not a thing that gets handed to people who aren't exceptional. None of that was visible when she stepped off the bus at Black Ridge. What was visible? 5'7", 141 pounds, hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun. A single duffel bag over one shoulder, worn at the strap from years of use. She didn't walk with attitude. She didn't walk like she was proving something. She walked the way people walk when they've already made peace with what they're walking into. The facility itself was austere in the way that military installations always managed to be. Not because of budget constraints, but because austerity was the message. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire. Concrete buildings painted the color of old sand. A flag that snapped in the pre-dawn desert wind. The rifle range was a half-mile beyond the main compound, visible as a series of dark berms against the brightening sky. A staff sergeant named DeLuca met them at the gate and walked them through in-processing with the enthusiasm of a man who had done this exact thing 140 times and was not interested in making it 141. Waivers. Medical clearance confirmation, weapons declaration, locker assignments. You move through the checklist with machine efficiency, calling names from a clipboard without looking up. Caldwell? Here. He looked up then. Just for a moment. Something crossed his face. Not hostility, exactly. More like recalibration. Like a man updating a mental file. Then he handed her a laminated ID card and moved on. She found her locker in the 3rd bay. The man on her left introduced himself as Tyler Reed out of 75th Ranger Regiment, with the easy confidence of someone who'd never seriously considered the possibility that he might fail at anything he attempted. He shook her hand like it was a formality. Reed, you? Caldwell. Prior sniper school? SOTIC. He raised an eyebrow, just slightly. Where are you stationed? Bragg. He nodded, the way people nod when they're storing information for later. This your first time here? Yeah. Mine too. He paused. You know anyone who's been through the program? No. Neither do I. He turned back to his locker. Guess we'll figure it out together. She didn't respond to that, not because she was unfriendly, but because she understood something Tyler Reed didn't yet, that this program was not designed for figuring things out together. It was designed to find out who you were when there was no one to figure things out with. The briefing was scheduled for 0600. Colonel Nathan Briggs walked in at 0558. Maya had read his file. She made it a habit to read the files of people she'd be working under. Briggs was 53, former Delta operator, 3 combat rotations, 2 Bronze Stars. He'd commanded the Black Ridge program for 9 years and had graduated 47 candidates out of what the program documentation described as highly selective cohort cycles. What the documentation didn't say, but what anyone who'd spent time around the program understood implicitly, was that Briggs ran the selection with a philosophy that was equal parts rigorous and rigid. He believed in a specific type of soldier. He had spent his career building and refining that belief. And that belief, by every available measure, did not include women. He was not a villain. That was the thing that made him complicated. He walked like a man who had earned his certainty through blood and repetition, and he stood at the front of the briefing room with the particular stillness of someone who hadn't been surprised by anything in a very long time. Gray at the temples, jaw like poured concrete, he looked at the assembled candidates the way a carpenter looks at raw lumber, calculating weight, grain, likelihood of failure under pressure. His eyes moved through the room in a sweep. They stopped on Maya. Not rudely, not theatrically. They simply stopped, the way a vehicle stops when it hits an unexpected obstacle in the road. A fraction of a second. Then his expression closed down into something neutral and unreadable, and he looked at DeLuca standing to his right. Who authorized this? His voice was quiet. That made it worse somehow. DeLuca kept his face perfectly professional. All candidates cleared standard screening, sir. That's not what I asked. A beat of silence. Sergeant Major Holloway approved the candidate list at the Pentagon level, sir. Sergeant Caldwell scored in the 93rd percentile across all entry qualifications. Briggs said nothing for a moment. He looked back at Maya, and this time there was nothing ambiguous about it. The room could feel it. 23 other candidates, most of them staring at the middle distance the way soldiers do when they're trying not to be present for something. Sergeant Caldwell? Sir? She stood. What's your current qualifying distance for long-range precision fire? 1,100 meters, sir, confirmed in field conditions. Field conditions. He repeated it like she'd said something slightly absurd. Black Ridge operates at ranges that exceed standard qualification benchmarks significantly. You understand that? I do, sir. This program has a 38% completion rate across all candidates, historically. I'm aware, sir. He held her gaze for 2 full seconds. Then he turned back to face the room as a whole. What I'm about to say applies to every candidate in this room, but I want it said clearly so there's no confusion. He clasped his hands behind his back. This program is not an opportunity. It is not a tryout. It is not a stage for anyone to prove a political point or satisfy a Pentagon quota. His voice was measured, controlled, the words falling like stones into still water. You are here because you have been told you are qualified. I am here to determine whether you actually are. There is a significant difference between those two things. He paused. Some of you will not finish week 1. Some of you will make it further and still fail. That is not a prediction. That is a pattern. Do not be surprised by it when it finds you. He hadn't looked at Maya again during any of that. He didn't need to. The message was clear enough. After the briefing, as candidates filed out to retrieve gear assignments, Tyler Reed fell into step beside her. Cheerful guy, he said quietly. Maya didn't answer. You good? She looked at him. Why wouldn't I be? He thought about that for a second. Fair enough, then. But then it got worse. An hour later, while the candidates were conducting initial weapons familiarization, a procedural exercise, standard, everyone running through the same NFA-TA-CR-equipped rifles they'd be using throughout the program, Briggs pulled DeLuca aside near the range entrance. Maya was positioned 2 stations down, running a chamber check with the unhurried precision of someone who had done it in the dark, in the rain, in the middle of gunfire. She wasn't trying to be impressive. She was just being competent. She heard it anyway. Voices carry differently in the desert. The air is thin and flat and has no architecture to absorb sound. I don't care what Holloway signed off on. This is my program. Sir, the authorization came from... I know where it came from. I'm telling you where it's going to end. A pause. Remove her from my program today. Maya's hands didn't stop moving. Chamber check. Bolt inspection. She seated the magazine with a controlled click. The man in the station next to her, Kowalski, she'd learn his name later, a quiet former Marine sniper with a scar running through his left eyebrow, glanced over at her briefly. She didn't look back at him. Remove her from my program today. She'd been told something similar before, in different words, in different contexts, by different men who all shared the same essential certainty. The certainty that what they saw when they looked at her was not a person to be evaluated, but a conclusion to be confirmed. She was used to it. That didn't mean it didn't land. It always landed. She just didn't let it show. Not because she was performing toughness, but because she'd learned a long time ago that visible reaction was the thing they were looking for. A flinch, a flush of anger, anything that could be pointed to afterward and used as evidence. She gave them nothing, finished her weapons check, set the rifle back in the rack with care, turned and walked to the water station without haste. DeLuca caught up with her there. He looked uncomfortable. That was the first human thing she'd noticed about him. Sergeant Caldwell. Staff Sergeant. The colonel has requested a review of your paperwork, procedural. He said the last word like he was aware of how hollow it sounded. It may take a day or two to clear. She looked at him for a moment. Am I being removed from the program? Not at this time. Has my authorization been revoked? No, Sergeant, it has not. Then I'll continue with the program until I'm told otherwise. She picked up her water bottle. Was there anything else, Staff Sergeant? He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Something close to respect, or maybe just recognition. No. Carry on. She did. The first week at Black Ridge was designed to find the fracture lines. Not in a dramatic way, nothing like the movie version of selection, where instructors scream in candidates' faces and men drop like cut timber. The Black Ridge approach was more surgical than that. 5-mile runs before breakfast, not in formation but staggered, each candidate wearing a GPS tracker and a heart rate monitor, their physiological data uploaded to a server that Briggs reviewed each evening. Sleep deprivation introduced gradually, but first through late-night tactical radio exercises, then through irregular stand-to schedules that ensured no candidate went more than 4 or 5 hours without interruption. Classroom instruction in wind reading, elevation calculation, and atmospheric effect on ballistic trajectory delivered at a pace that assumed prior knowledge and punished the gaps. The attrition started on day 3. A former Navy SEAL named Hartley left during the pre-dawn run, not because he couldn't physically continue, but because he got turned around in a featureless stretch of scrubland in the dark, made a navigation error, and arrived at the checkpoint 11 minutes late. 11 minutes. Briggs reviewed the data that evening, and Hartley was gone by morning. 11 minutes, Tyler Reed said at the mess table, staring at his food. That's it. That's enough, said Kowalski across from him. He didn't elaborate. Maya was sitting one seat down, eating a piece of cornbread and reviewing hand-drawn notes she'd made during the morning's ballistics instruction. She hadn't contributed to the conversation, but Reed looked over at her. What do you think? She looked up. I think he got lost and lost time, and time in this program has a cost attached to it. You don't think it's harsh? I think harsh is a word people use when they expected something different. She looked back at her notes. He didn't make a navigation error because he was tired. He made it because he didn't have a backup reference plan when his primary landmarks disappeared in the dark. Reed thought about that. How would you have done it differently? I would have memorized the terrain contour lines before the run. Not just the route, the terrain. So if I lose visual reference, I have something else to orient from. Reed was quiet for a moment. You do that? Before every run? Before everything. Kowalski glanced over at her, said nothing, but he was listening. What? The rifle range came on day 6. Up to that point, Maya had been performing, Not spectacularly, not in any way designed to draw attention. She'd finished every run in the top third of the group, but never first. Her classroom scores were strong, but not the highest posted. She'd been precisely, consistently, unremarkably competent, which was intentional. She understood the environment well enough to know that standing out early in a group that already resented her presence was not strategy, it was provocation. But the rifle range was different. The rifle range was her element. The morning was cold, 42 degrees with a variable wind running through the canyon in shifting patterns that made standard flag-based wind reading unreliable. The range safety officer briefed the candidates on the course of fire. 100-yard incremental qualification shooting from 200 to 800 meters, with time limits per string and scoring based on a combination of hit percentage and time to engagement. Standard. Nothing exotic, except for the wind. Maya spent the first 15 minutes at her mat doing nothing, not checking her scope adjustments, not dry firing. She lay behind the rifle and watched. The range flags told one story. The environment told another. She watched a pair of ravens cutting lateral passes through the upper canyon airspace, the way their wingtips adjusted microscopically as they moved through different pressure zones. She watched the fine grit on the berm surface at the 200-yard mark, the way it moved in small pulses, interrupted, then resumed. She watched the thermal shimmer building off the dark rock face to the northeast and calculated the time it would take for that thermal column to start affecting the air between her muzzle and the target line. "Caldwell," the range safety officer called. "You're holding up the line." "Ready, sir." She settled into the rifle. Sending. The first shot was at 200. Impact, move on, 300. Impact, 400. She made a half MOA adjustment she hadn't told anyone about, based on something she'd observed in the dust movement. Impact, 500, 600, 700. At 800 meters, with the wind doing something unpredictable between the canyon walls, she slowed. Everyone expected her to rush it. She could feel it. The particular quality of attention that comes from a group of people who want to watch something fail. She breathed out halfway. Let the crosshairs float. Come on, she thought. Tell me where you're going. The thermal column shifted. The air in the canyon reorganized itself along a new axis for exactly 3 seconds. She fired. Impact. Then again. And again. 10 rounds, 10 impacts, in the upper percentile of time for the string. The range went quiet in the particular way that places go quiet when something has happened that no one quite knows how to process. She unloaded the rifle, flagged the chamber, and sat up. From behind her, she heard the range officer reading her data into the radio. His voice was perfectly flat. "Caldwell, sequence complete. 10 for 10. Time on string, 2 minutes, 41. Someone, she didn't know who, said quietly, "Jesus." She began breaking down her position without expression. Around her, she could feel the recalibration happening, the invisible social process of people updating their assessments. It wasn't comfortable for any of them, herself included, because she understood that what comes after recalibration is often not acceptance, but resistance. People don't like being wrong. Men with authority don't like it more than most. That evening, the scores were posted. Maya's name sat at the top of Day 6 evaluations. She walked past the board without stopping to look. She didn't need to. But Briggs was standing 20 feet away when she passed, and she felt his eyes on her back for the full length of the corridor. When she reached her bunk, she sat on the edge of it in the dark for a minute, not moving. Her hands rested on her knees. The day was finally unwrapping itself into the quiet. She let herself feel the weight of it. Not pride, nothing that clean, but something harder to name. The particular exhaustion of a person who has to be twice as good to be seen as half as capable. And who does it anyway, because what's the alternative? She reached under her bunk and retrieved a small photograph from inside a worn brown envelope. A man in his 50s, squinting into sunlight, holding a rifle she recognized as a .308 bolt action she still owned. Her father, Thomas Caldwell. Career Army. 2 wars. A man who never once told her what she couldn't do. She'd been 7 years old when he first took her to the range. The rifle was bigger than she was. He hadn't modified the lesson for her size. He'd just knelt down beside her and said, "The wind is always talking. You just have to learn to shut up long enough to hear it. She put the photograph away, stretched out on the bunk, closed her eyes. She did not sleep right away. Through the wall of the barracks, she could hear Reed and two other candidates running through radio procedures on a training set, the crackle of the squelch, the practiced cadence of tactical comms, the sound of people who were not resting when they should be, burning reserves they would need later. She wanted to tell them. She didn't. Not yet. The mods. On day 8, Briggs assigned her an additional evaluation. It was presented as routine, a secondary qualification in close quarters methodology, CQB targeting protocols, the integration of precision fire in an urban scenario rather than open terrain. The other candidates weren't required to complete it. DeLuca told her this while she was pulling gear from the armory. He said it like it was procedural. Standard operating procedures. Nothing personal. She looked at him. Of course, she said. What time? 1400. I'll be there. She arrived at 1345. She was the only candidate on the range. The scenario was set up in a shoot house at the west end of the facility, a reconfigured MOUT structure, multiple rooms, shoot and no-shoot targets scattered through the space in a pattern that wasn't randomized but was designed to look randomized. She'd seen this kind of thing before. She worked through it methodically, clearing each room with the movement efficiency of someone who'd done it under actual fire in actual buildings in actual combat situations. When she came out the other side, the evaluator, a warrant officer named Price, checked his clipboard without expression. Time, 4 minutes 12. Engagement accuracy, 91%. 1 no-shoot engagement. She knew which target it was. A partial exposure behind a door frame, one hand visible, no weapon indicated. She'd hesitated a quarter second because the hand position was ambiguous, consistent with either a reaching motion or a concealed weapon draw. She'd engaged because the subsequent room geometry didn't give her a safe angle of avoidance. That's a civilian down, Price said. That's an ambiguous exposure in a structure where the threat index was already elevated, she said calmly. Given the room geometry and the lack of a safe bypass angle, engagement was within doctrine. Price made a note on the clipboard. It'll go in the report. I know. She began clearing her weapon. Will the report also include a notation that this evaluation was not required of other candidates in my cohort? Price looked up. She met his eyes. Not aggressively, not with anger, just with the calm, direct look of someone who wants a factual thing acknowledged. He said nothing for a moment. Then, carry on, Sergeant. She carried on. Back at the barracks, she sat at the small desk in her quarters and wrote a careful, precise log entry. Not a complaint, not a grievance, a log. Date, time, the nature of the evaluation, the scoring criteria, her performance, and a single line at the end. No equivalent evaluation was required of other candidates on this date. She had been writing logs like this for 11 years. She had never filed a single one, but she kept them. Because the day might come when the record mattered, and when that day arrived, she wanted the record to be accurate. That night, Tyler Reed knocked on her door. She opened it. He was holding 2 cups of coffee and looked slightly embarrassed, which was not an expression she'd expected to see on him. I didn't know what you took in it, he said, so I brought 2 blacks. She took one, leaned against the doorframe. What do you want, Reed? He had the decency not to pretend that was an unfair question. I heard about the CQB eval today. Word travels fast. Small program. He looked at his coffee. For what it's worth, and I'm not sure it's worth a lot, I think it was bullshit. She considered that. Okay. That's it? Okay. What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something. He shifted his weight. Something that sounds like you're pissed off, maybe, because I'd be pissed off. She looked at him for a moment. Really looked at him. This young, capable, well-meaning man who had grown up in a world where righteous anger was an option available to him, where pissed off was a legitimate response to unfairness rather than evidence that you didn't belong. Being pissed off costs something, she said finally. And I don't have anything to spare right now. She stepped back from the door. Get some sleep, Reed. We've got a pre-dawn navigation exercise tomorrow, and you're going to need a backup reference plan. He blinked. A backup? Terrain contour lines. Before you sleep. She closed the door. Outside, the desert had gone completely silent the way deserts do. That deep structural silence that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of enormous space. She stood in the middle of her quarters and pressed both hands flat against the surface of the desk. 11 years? 2 deployments, 41 confirmed engagements, a record built shot by shot in places most people would never see, against odds most people would never face. And tomorrow she would wake up at 0430 and do it all again, in a program run by a man who had decided she would fail before she ever fired a single round. She sat down, opened her notes, and started reviewing terrain contour lines for a navigation exercise she already knew she was going to finish first. She was right about that. What she couldn't yet know was what Briggs was doing at exactly that same moment, 3 buildings away, sitting alone at his desk with her file open, a pen in his hand, writing a single word at the bottom of Day 8's evaluation report. Questionable. Not because her scores were questionable, because she was still there, still performing, still refusing to be the failure he had decided she already was. And that, to a man whose entire identity was built on the certainty of his own judgment, was the most threatening thing she could possibly have done. The words sat on the page like a verdict. Questionable. Briggs capped the pen and leaned back in his chair, the springs giving a low protest under his weight. The fluorescent light above his desk hummed at a frequency that had stopped bothering him years ago. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, then at the file, then at nothing in particular. Outside his window, the desert was doing what the desert always did at this hour, swallowing every sound, every light, every evidence that human beings were out there trying to prove something. He closed the file, but he didn't turn off the light. That detail would have meant something to Maya, if she'd known about it. She would have recognized it for what it was, the small, involuntary sign of a man who wasn't as settled in his certainty as he needed people to believe. But she didn't know about it, and he would not have admitted it, and so the light burned alone in his office until past midnight while the rest of the compound went dark. 3 buildings away, Maya finished her terrain review at 2,247, folded the map with the crisp economy of someone who'd been doing it since childhood, and got exactly 5 hours and 13 minutes of sleep. She woke before the alarm. She always did. Day 9 began with rain, not the hard driving kind, but the thin, persistent desert rain that soaks you gradually and makes everything smell like wet rock and iron. The navigation exercise ran from 0430 until the last candidate cleared the final checkpoint, which turned out to be a 6-hour window because 3 candidates made the same error Hartley had made 6 days earlier, just at a different bend in the same dark terrain. Maya finished in 3 hours and 40 minutes, first in the cohort by 11 minutes. She stood at the final checkpoint and drank water and said nothing to the evaluator who marked her time, and the evaluator said nothing to her, and that was fine. She was used to victories that no one made noise about. Reed came in second. He found her at the staging area afterwards, still catching his breath, hands on his knees. He looked up at her with expression caught somewhere between impressed and annoyed. "How did you—" He stopped. "The contour lines." "The contour lines," she agreed. "I used them, and I still came in second." "You came in second by 11 minutes out of a 6-hour exercise." She handed him her water bottle because his was empty. "That's not a problem." He took the water. "What are you like when you're actually trying to help someone?" She considered that. "Slightly more verbal." He laughed, a short, surprise sound, like he hadn't expected it. It was the first time she'd seen him do something that didn't seem calculated. She filed it away. Kowalski checked in 40 minutes after Reed, soaked through, jaw tight, the look of a man digesting something unpleasant. He sat down on the equipment crate next to Maya without asking and spent 30 seconds just breathing. Then, without preamble or any apparent self-consciousness, "Your checkpoint intervals. You didn't follow the marked route past the second ridge." She looked at him. He had watchful eyes, dark and careful, the kind of eyes that missed things deliberately when it suited him and missed nothing when it didn't. The scar through his left eyebrow had faded to white against his tan. "No," she said. "I cut the 3rd marked leg. That adds 300 meters of elevation. It cuts 700 meters of total distance and puts you above the primary wind line. You run faster downslope, and your navigation references are more stable from high ground." He said nothing for a moment. She could see him doing the geometry in his head, checking it against his own experience. "That's a technical risk assessment in the dark on unfamiliar terrain," he said finally. "Yes. How confident were you?" "Confident enough." He absorbed that. "Where'd you learn to think like that?" "Molly," she said. And then, because he'd asked a real question and deserved a real answer, "And my father." Kowalski nodded slowly, the way men nod when they understand something they aren't going to press on. He handed her back the water bottle Reed had handed her 2 minutes ago. The three of them sat in the wet dawn for a while without talking, and it was the most comfortable silence Maya had experienced in 9 days. The change in the cohort was not sudden. It never is. It happened the way most real changes happen, in small adjustments, almost invisible individually, that accumulated into something you could only recognize after the fact. Reed started asking her questions, not performatively, not to demonstrate open-mindedness, but in the practical, direct way of someone who was interested in getting better and had identified a resource. He asked about wind correction techniques, about how she managed breathing control during long-duration hides, about the specific protocol she used for reading heat signatures on the berm at midday. She answered him the same way, practically, without editorializing, without the slight condescension that often crept into expert instruction when the expert was aware of the gap in knowledge. Kowalski watched these exchanges from a distance for 2 days before he joined them. Then it was the three of them at the end of the shooting day, debriefing their strings over cold coffee in the equipment bay, going over what worked and what hadn't with a kind of quiet intensity that the other candidates started gravitating toward. By day 12, there were 6 people in the informal debrief. By day 15, 9. Briggs noticed. Maya knew he noticed because DeLuca told her, not directly, not in any way that could be characterized as disloyalty to his commanding officer, but in the slight change of his manner when he brought her the day's evaluation sheets. A fractional increase in the care he took when he explained the day's schedule. The way he looked at her slightly longer than necessary when he asked if she needed anything. She understood what those small signals meant. She'd been reading small signals from men who were trying to stay neutral her entire career. Briggs was disturbed by what he was seeing, and a disturbed Briggs was a dangerous one. The new evaluation came on day 16. She was at the long-range range when DeLuca found her. 6:40, between the first and second shooting strings of the morning. He told her quietly that the colonel had scheduled an additional assessment for her at 1100, ballistic theory, advanced scenario problem sets, and a practical evaluation she'd be briefed on when she arrived. "Same as the CQB?" she asked. DeLuca's expression stayed professional. "Additional qualification, Sergeant." "Of course." She looked downrange. Wind was running left to right at about 8 miles per hour. Mild oscillation. She had 2 more strings before the morning session wrapped. "I'll be there." She was there at 10:50. The practical evaluation turned out to be a timed problem set. 7 long-range shooting scenarios presented as written dossiers with partial information, target descriptions, environmental data with deliberate gaps, range estimates with noted uncertainty values. She was expected to construct a complete engagement solution for each, documenting her decision matrix, her data sources, her uncertainty tolerances, and her final firing solution with a stated probability of first-round hit. It was a sophisticated assessment, genuinely sophisticated, not the kind of thing that could be failed through lack of preparation by a candidate who actually knew their craft. But it was also 6 hours long, required to be completed alone, and had not been administered to a single other candidate in the current cohort. She knew this because she'd checked the evaluation room schedule, which was posted on the coordination board outside the S3 office, and her name was the only one on it. She sat down, opened the first scenario dossier, and began working. By hour 3, her right hand was cramping from the amount of calculation work. She flexed it under the table, worked the knuckles, kept going. Scenario 4 involved a moving target at 1,100 meters through a canyon corridor with a 15-knot crosswind and a 6-second exposure window. She worked through the angular velocity math twice to make sure she had it right. Scenario 5 involved a simultaneous two-target engagement from a fixed position with a required time on target under 3 seconds. She finished with 40 minutes to spare. The evaluator, not Price this time, a different warrant officer she hadn't seen before, collected her materials without comment and told her she was dismissed. "Will I receive a score today?" she asked. "The results will be incorporated into your evaluation file. And my evaluation file is accessible to me per AR 623-3. He looked up. "It is." "Good." She stood, rolled her shoulder to work out the tension that had built up during 6 hours of desk work, and walked out into the afternoon sun. She went directly to the water point, drank a full liter without stopping, stood in the thin desert sunlight with her eyes closed for exactly 60 seconds, feeling the heat on her face. There was a particular kind of mental exhaustion that came from sustained precision cognitive work, different from physical fatigue, harder in some ways to recover from quickly. She'd learned to respect it. Pushing through it without recovery produced errors, and errors in this program were currency you couldn't afford to spend. When she opened her eyes, Kowalski was leaning against the wall 10 feet away, arms crossed, watching her with the neutral expression he wore when he was thinking hard about something. 6 hours, he said. "Long day," she agreed. "Reed and I ran the afternoon accuracy drills. You missed them." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Every time your number comes up in that building, the rest of us aren't in it." She looked at him. "I'm not blind," he said. It wasn't sympathetic exactly. It was something more valuable than sympathy. It was witness. The flat, clear acknowledgement of a man who had seen something and was not going to pretend he hadn't. "No," she said. "You're not. Does it bother you?" The honest answer was complicated, and she didn't have the energy for complicated right now. "It's a variable I account for," she said. "Like wind." He looked at her for a long moment. "I was in Fallujah in 2006, he said finally. "I had a team leader who wanted me gone the first week because I was the only Pole in a unit that had lost somebody to friendly fire from a Polish contingent in a previous deployment. Nothing I did was right for the first month." He paused. "I didn't figure out until later that being right wasn't the point. Being gone was the point." She held his gaze. "What did you do?" "I stayed." He uncrossed his arms, pushed off the wall, and I was better than any two of them combined by the time the deployment ended, which didn't make me popular but made me necessary. He started walking toward the barracks. "Come to dinner." Reed found a way to make the mess coffee slightly less terrible. He's very proud of himself about it. She followed him. Dinner in the mess that evening had a different quality to it, harder to name than describe. The 9-person informal group that had been coalescing around the evening debriefs occupied a long table near the back, and the conversation was looser, less guarded than the first week's careful silence. Someone told a story about a navigation disaster during RASP that ended with 2 candidates sharing a single emergency poncho in a drainage ditch for 4 hours. And the table laughed in the real way, the way people laugh when they've been stressed long enough that humor becomes biological necessity. Maya ate and listened and contributed 3 sentences to the conversation over the course of an hour. At one point, Reed looked over at her with a slightly incredulous expression. "Do you ever just talk? Like, about anything? Not tactical?" She thought about it. "I'm talking now. You've said maybe 40 words. Quality over quantity." "That's not a real answer." "It's the one you're getting." The table laughed. She didn't, quite, but something in her expression shifted in a way that Reed apparently found satisfying because he let it go. After dinner, walking back across the compound in the cooling desert air, Kowalski fell into step beside her. "Reed asked me today if I thought you were going to make it through." She didn't break stride. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was the wrong question." She glanced over at him. "The right question," he continued, "is whether the program is going to survive having you in it." He said it without inflection, as a pure observation, the way he said most things. "Because you're not just clearing the bars. You're making the rest of us clear them differently." She said nothing for a moment. They walked through the gap between the equipment bay and the barracks block, and the wind moved through it with a sound like something being cleared away. My father used to say that the best thing a shooter can do isn't the shot, she said. It's helping the shooter next to them understand the wind. Kowalski considered that. He sounds like a smart man. He was. The past tense sat between them, quiet and complete. He didn't push on it. Get some sleep, he said at the barracks door. You too. Charles. Day 18 brought Briggs back to the rifle range. He came at mid-morning, unscheduled, which everyone noticed because nothing Briggs did at Black Ridge was unscheduled. He stood at the range officer's position with his hands at his sides and watched the strings without speaking. The candidates performed, some better than usual, some worse. The performance anxiety of being observed by the commanding officer working differently on different people. Maya performed the same. Not worse, not better. Exactly the same as she always performed, because she had spent years training herself to make the presence or absence of observers completely irrelevant to her execution. She'd learned it the hard way, in Kandahar, where the presence of an unseen observer could mean something entirely different than career evaluation, and inconsistency could get people killed. She ran her string, confirmed her impacts, cleared her weapon, and moved to the debrief position. She could feel Briggs watching her. She kept her eyes forward. Afterward, as the range was going to Condition 4 and candidates were returning equipment, she turned from the cleaning station and found herself within 15 feet of him. He was standing alone, the range officer having moved off to deal with a scoring discrepancy on the far end. He was looking at something on a clipboard. He didn't look up when she approached. She wasn't approaching him. She was walking toward the equipment cage, which required passing within his radius. But he spoke before she reached him. Your atmospherics correction on string 3 was non-standard. She stopped. Yes, sir. You used a 3-component correction rather than standard 2-factor. Environmental conditions warranted it, sir. The thermal column off the northeast rock face was affecting the mid-range trajectory window in a way the standard 2-factor table doesn't account for. He was quiet for a moment, still looking at the clipboard. Your father was Thomas Caldwell, he said. It wasn't a question. Something shifted in her chest. Small, controlled. Yes, sir. He served in this district in the mid-90s as a range safety officer. He paused. Before he moved to SOTIC. That's correct. Now he looked up. His eyes were gray-blue, hard, the kind of eyes that had spent decades refusing to show surprise. But something was working behind them. She could see it the way she could see wind working through grass. Not the wind itself, but the effect of it. He talked about this canyon, Briggs said. In a training document I read a long time ago. Something about the northeast thermal column. She held his gaze. He studied it for 3 years. I remember thinking it was a very specific piece of knowledge. It was. She kept her voice steady. He taught it to me when I was 9. The clipboard came down to his side. He looked at her for 2 full seconds. Not the assessing look from the first day, not the dismissive look that had followed it. Something different. Something that might, in a different man at a different time, have been the beginning of something. But Briggs was not in a different time, and the wall that his 9 years of certainty had built was not going to come down in a 2-second pause on a rifle range. Continue your program, Sergeant, he said. Yes, sir. She walked past him to the equipment cage. Her hands were completely steady. She made sure of it. Boss. It was Reed who found out about Ghost Target 7. He came to the evening debrief on day 21 with a different energy, quieter than usual, less quick with the commentary. He sat down with his coffee and for 10 minutes just listened while Kowalski walked through the wind correction errors he'd diagnosed from his own afternoon strings. Then, when there was a gap, I asked DeLuca about the Upper Canyon range, he said, the one they keep locked. The table shifted. It was subtle, but it happened. A slight gathering of attention, like a room where the barometric pressure has changed. What about it? Someone asked. He didn't want to tell me. Reed turned the coffee cup in his hands. I asked 3 times. Eventually, he said it was the final qualification course. That's the Ghost Range, said a candidate named Okoye, who'd been through a previous program selection at another facility and had heard things. Target 7. What's Target 7? Reed asked. Okoye looked around the table like he was trying to decide how much to say. It's a shot nobody in the program has ever completed, not in 32 years. The table went quiet. "What kind of shot?" Kowalski asked. "I don't know the specifics. I just know it's the final qualifier and it's never been done." Maya had known about Ghost Target 7 since before she arrived at Black Ridge. She'd known about it because her father had attempted it 28 years ago in a different cohort of this same program. He'd missed by what his notation recorded as 11 centimeters at the impact zone, a number she had memorized the same way she'd memorized the terrain contour lines, the atmospheric data, the northeast thermal column behavior. She knew the distance. She knew the canyon geometry. She knew the historical meteorological patterns for this region in this month. She had been preparing for this shot for a very long time. She did not say any of this at the debrief table. She drank her coffee and listened to the others process the information. The mix of intimidation and curiosity and competitive instinct that moved through the group like current through a wire. She let them talk. But across the table, Kowalski caught her eye. He had been watching her face while Okoye talked. He'd seen something there, in the moment before she smoothed it away. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with those careful dark eyes that missed very little. And she understood from the quality of that look that he had just filed something important about her. She looked away first. Outside, the desert had gone dark and absolute. And somewhere in the upper canyon, behind a locked gate and a record that had stood for 32 years, a target waited in the dark that she had been moving toward, one careful step at a time, for longer than anyone in this program understood. She didn't sleep well that night. Not because of anxiety. She'd long since trained that particular response out of herself, or at least into something manageable, something that didn't keep her staring at the ceiling. It was something else. The particular alertness of a person who knows they are close to something they have been moving toward for a very long time, and whose body understands this before their mind has finished processing it. She lay on her bunk in the dark and listened to the desert and thought about her father. Thomas Caldwell had attempted Ghost Target 7 in the autumn, 28 years ago, in a cohort that had produced 6 of the finest precision marksmen the Army had seen in that decade. He'd been 31 years old. He'd documented his attempt in a field notebook that Maya had found in a shoebox under his workbench 3 months after his funeral. 7 pages of handwritten notes, elevation calculations, wind observations, a hand-drawn diagram of the canyon geometry with thermal column annotations that had taken her 3 readings to fully understand. At the bottom of the last page, in the cramped, precise handwriting she'd known all her life, a single line, missed, northeast column shifted at the moment of fire. Need more time in the canyon. Need to know when it moves. He never went back. The program moved him on. Life moved him on. And eventually a roadside device outside of Mosul moved him permanently to a place where canyon wind behavior and thermal columns and impossible shots no longer mattered. She had the notebook with her. She'd carried it in the bottom of her duffel bag since Bragg. She hadn't looked at it since she arrived. She got up at 03:30, an hour before the alarm, and sat at her desk and opened it for the first time at Black Ridge. She read it through twice, slowly, in the thin yellow light of her desk lamp. The canyon diagram, the thermal annotations, the elevation data recorded at 15-minute intervals across 4 observation sessions. He'd known what she knew. He'd seen what she'd been seeing every time she studied the northeast rock face from the main range. The column shifted between 0847 and 0923 on clear mornings. A 76-minute window, give or take, depending on cloud cover and overnight temperature differential. That was the window. She closed the notebook and put it back at the bottom of the bag and sat in the silence for a while. Then she made herself a cup of instant coffee from the small supplies she kept in the desk drawer and drank it standing by the window, looking at the darkness outside where the canyon was invisible but present, out there in the black Nevada night, waiting. She was ready. She just needed the program to get there. Days 22 through 27 were a grind in the specific way that late-stage selection grinds, not the fresh brutality of week 1, but the accumulated weight of sustained performance under sustained scrutiny, compounded by the knowledge that the end was close enough to see and therefore close enough to lose. The cohort had thinned from 24 to 16. 2 men had left for medical reasons, while one a genuine knee injury, one something that the program documentation would describe as voluntary withdrawal, but that everyone in the barracks understood as a man who had reached his limit and had the self-awareness to acknowledge it before the program did it for him. 3 more had been cut for performance deficiencies that the evaluation system identified with the cold efficiency of a machine that didn't care how hard you'd tried. 16 left. The composition of the final group had a different texture to it, quieter, more deliberate. The easy banter of the early days replaced by something more focused and a little ragged around the edges. People were managing their resources carefully. Sleep was currency. Conversation was rationed. Maya had been managing her resources carefully since day 1. But the additional evaluations hadn't stopped. Day 23 brought a written examination on ballistic theory at the doctoral level, material that went substantially beyond the standard program curriculum and that she was given 8 hours to complete. She finished in 6.5 and spent the remaining 90 minutes reviewing her answers with the care of someone who understood that the examination was not really about the material. Day 25 brought a practical exercise in which she was asked to construct a firing solution for a scenario that contained 3 deliberate errors in the provided atmospheric data. Errors subtle enough that a less experienced operator would incorporate them into their calculation and produce a fundamentally flawed solution. She identified all 3, documented them with cited reasoning, and built her solution from corrected data. The evaluating warrant officer, the same one from the scenario dossiers, whose name she'd finally learned was Garza, received her completed materials with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You flagged the data errors," he said. "Yes, Warrant." The instructions said to build a firing solution from the provided data. The instructions said to build a firing solution. The provided data contained errors that would have produced a solution inconsistent with real-world conditions. She looked at him. If this were an operational scenario, using the uncorrected data would result in a miss, potentially a consequential miss. Garza was quiet for a moment. "You understand this creates an evaluation problem." "I understand it creates a documentation problem," she said, "which I've resolved by flagging the errors with detailed reasoning. If the evaluation standard requires that I use flawed data to produce a flawed solution, that standard itself needs to be examined." It wasn't aggressive. She said it the way she said most things, evenly, with the specific clarity of someone who had thought it through and was prepared to defend it. Garza looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a note on his clipboard. She never found out what the note said. Reed found her that evening during the informal debrief and pulled her aside with an urgency she hadn't seen from him before. "Something's happening," he said. "Narrow it down." "Briggs, he met with DeLuca and Garza for 2 hours today. Nobody else in the building." He kept his voice low, though the nearest occupied table was 30 feet away. "I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I've been watching how this place runs, and 2-hour closed meetings between Briggs and his senior evaluators don't happen unless something's being decided." She considered this. "What do you think is being decided?" "I think he's building a case." Reed looked uncomfortable, like a man who doesn't want to say the thing he's saying but has decided it needs to be said anyway. "Against you, specifically." She was quiet. "Your evaluations, the CQB thing, the scenario set, every additional assessment that only applies to you." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not a lawyer, but that pattern has a shape to it." "Yes," she said, "it does." "So what are you going to do?" She looked at him. He was leaning forward slightly, weight on the balls of his feet, the body language of someone who was ready to help if she'd let him. It was genuine. She'd learned to read the difference between genuine and performed over 11 years, and Reed was one of the genuine ones, which was one of the reasons she'd started talking to him at all. "The same thing I've been doing," she said. He blinked. "That's it? What else would you do?" "I don't know. Push back? File something? You have documentation, right? You told me you keep logs." "Do." "So use them." She shook her head, not dismissively. There was something almost tired in it. "Reed, if I file a complaint right now, in the middle of the program, with 10 days left, I become the candidate who filed a complaint. Not the candidate who's leading the cohort in every evaluated metric. The complaint becomes the story." She picked up her coffee. "The only story I want told here is the one written by my scores." He was quiet for a moment, working through it. And if that's not enough? She looked at him steadily. It'll be enough. She said it without hesitation, without performance. Just the flat conviction of someone who had made a calculation and was prepared to live inside the result. Reed sat back. Okay. He nodded slowly. Okay. Hold. Day 28. Maya was at the main range for the morning session when DeLuca appeared at the range entrance and walked directly to her mat with the deliberate, uninflected movement of a man delivering a message he hasn't been asked his opinion about. Colonel wants to see you. Now. She cleared her weapon, safed it, set it in the rack. Followed him. Briggs's office was the same as every field-grade officer's office she'd ever been in. Utilitarian, organized with military precision, the walls holding the accumulated citations and photographs of a career that had been long and serious. She stood in front of his desk at parade rest and waited while he finished a handwritten note he was working on. He didn't make her wait long, maybe 40 seconds, long enough to establish something about the dynamic, but not long enough to be theatrical about it. He put the pen down and looked at her. Sergeant Caldwell, sit. She sat. The chair was deliberately uncomfortable. She didn't adjust. I've reviewed your complete evaluation file, he began, including the additional assessments. Yes, sir. Your performance is technically strong. He said it the way a person says something true that they are not fully comfortable saying. Across both standard and supplemental metrics. Thank you, sir. That wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. He folded his hands on the desk. What I want to discuss is your methodology. She waited. You've been conducting informal instruction sessions with other candidates, sharing techniques, correction methods, tactical approaches. Evening debriefs, sir. Voluntary participation. No program time used. I'm aware of the logistics. His jaw tightened slightly. What I want to understand is your rationale. She looked at him. My rationale for what, sir? For investing in the performance of candidates who are your direct competition. She let the question sit for a moment. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she wanted to give him the honest one rather than the smart one. And the honest one needed a second to organize itself. Because a better shooter on my left makes me better, she said. And because if I'm the best person in this cohort, but the people who graduate with me are mediocre, then whatever we're supposed to produce together will reflect that. Briggs studied her. That's an unusually collaborative philosophy for an individual qualification program. With respect, sir, the program qualifies individuals, but precision fire in operational context is almost never an individual endeavor. There's always a spotter, always a team, always a command structure. What you can do alone is a fraction of what you can do when the people around you are operating at a high level. He was quiet for long enough that she could hear the HVAC unit cycling in the ceiling. Your father had a similar philosophy, he said finally. There it was again, the second mention. She kept her face still. Did you know him, sir? Briefly, when I was a young lieutenant and he was a range safety officer here. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not assessing, not dismissive, not the careful neutrality he usually wore. Something older and more complicated. He was, patient with young officers who thought they already knew everything. That sounds like him, she said quietly. Briggs picked up his pen and set it down again, a small, uncharacteristic fidget. The final qualification course runs in 11 days. Ghost Target 7 is the terminal event. He looked at her directly. In 32 years, no candidate has completed it. I'm aware of that, sir. Are you aware of the specific parameters? Not officially, sir. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. She looked at it without touching it. Distance notation. 1,340 meters. Canyon corridor exposure. Variable crosswind. 3-round confirmation requirement. 3 rounds. Her father had only had 1. The qualification requires 3 confirmed impacts on a target with a 9-inch strike face, Briggs said. Within a single firing session. No reshoot protocol. Yes, sir. The record of attempts is 112 over 32 years. He paused. The closest anyone has come is a single confirmed impact. One candidate, 2009.
He missed the second round. She nodded, said nothing. I'm telling you this so that you understand what you're facing. His voice had changed slightly. Not warmer exactly, but stripped of something. The top layer of something. Not to discourage you, to ensure you have accurate information. She looked at him. Why now, sir? He met her eyes. The question landed the way she'd intended it to. With full weight, no deflection available. Why now, when for 28 days every piece of information he could add friction to had been delivered through intermediaries and evaluations and closed-door meetings? He didn't answer for a moment. Because, he said finally, I intend to run a clean qualification. Whatever my personal assessment of any candidate's suitability has been, the terminal event will be evaluated without variance. She held his gaze. I appreciate that, sir. She wasn't sure she believed it.
But she appreciated him saying it, and she thought that the act of saying it might be its own form of small, difficult movement in a man who didn't move easily. Dismissed, he said. She stood, came to attention, turned, and walked out. 11 days had a shape to them she could feel. The program accelerated in that final stretch. More range time, longer strings, complex multivariable scenarios run under timed pressure that compressed everything she'd been building for a month into rapid successive demonstrations. The cohort was down to 14 by day 30. A candidate named Mbeki left on day 31 with a performance notice that nobody was surprised by, and another named Yates left the same day for a reason nobody explained and nobody pushed on. 12 candidates for the terminal qualification. Maya spent the 4 days before the final event in a disciplined, specific routine. Morning range work to keep her mechanics sharp, but not to peak. She'd learned years ago that peaking too early was as damaging as not peaking at all. Afternoons in the study room, running atmospheric calculations for the canyon based on the meteorological forecast she'd pulled from the weather station data that candidates had access to for training purposes. Evenings with the small group, quieter now, more inward, everyone managing the final stretch in their own way. She didn't tell anyone about the window, not Reed, not Kowalski, not anyone. It wasn't strategic exactly. It was just that some knowledge is load-bearing in a particular way. It holds up the thing you're building, and if you share it before the structure is complete, there's risk in the sharing that there isn't in the keeping. She'd know when the moment came. The night before the qualification, she sat on her bunk with her father's notebook open in her lap. She didn't read it. She'd memorized it months ago. She just held it, the physical weight of it in her hands, the worn cover, and the pages that still held a faint trace of the specific smell of his workshop. Cedar and gun oil, and something she'd never been able to name. She was tired. Not the acute fatigue of a bad night, but the deep structural tiredness of a month of maximum performance under sustained pressure. Her right shoulder carried a chronic knot that no amount of stretching had fully resolved. The first 2 fingers of her left hand had a faint tremor when she'd been still too long. A legacy of a tendon injury from Kandahar that she'd never fully disclosed on her medical clearance because the injury was managed and functional, and she'd known that disclosure would be used as a reason before it was ever used as information. She wasn't perfect. She knew that. She was good enough. She knew that too. She closed the notebook, put it under her bunk, and went to sleep. Ghost Canyon ran northeast to southwest, a quarter-mile of compressed desert geology that the sun hit at a low angle in the morning and not at all from mid-afternoon on. The firing position was on a stabilized concrete pad at the southwest entrance, elevated 6 feet above the canyon floor on a rock shelf. The target, she couldn't see it yet. The distance and the canyon's first bend made it invisible from the staging area, was somewhere in the northeastern darkness, 9 inches of steel face waiting at the end of 1,340 meters of variable air. The 12 remaining candidates assembled at the staging area at 700. A desert morning, clear sky, temperature at 47 degrees with a light northeast wind that would change as the sun came up and the rock faces began absorbing heat. She checked the wind flag at the staging area. Light. 4, maybe 5 knots. The flag at the canyon entrance, visible 200 meters away, told a slightly different story. The same direction, but with a subtle oscillation suggesting the canyon was already doing what canyons do, which is redirect and compress whatever air moves through them according to their own private geometry. Briggs was there. He stood with his hands behind his back near the range safety officer's position, not speaking to anyone. His face was the same as it always was, composed, contained, giving nothing. DeLuca stood to his left. Garza was at the scoring station with a radio and a spotting scope. The range safety officer, a master sergeant named Hollis, who had been with the program for 6 years, ran the briefing. Each candidate would fire in sequence, drawn by lot. The order had been posted on the board that morning. Maya was 11th. She had spent exactly 0 mental energy worrying about the order, because the order was irrelevant. What mattered was the window. The northeast column shifted between 0847 and 0923, give or take. She needed to be behind the trigger during that window. 11th of 12, at roughly 8 to 10 minutes per candidate, including setup and breakdown, put her around 0820 to 0840 if the sequence ran efficiently. Close to the window. Possibly inside it, depending on how the morning ran. She watched the first candidate take the pad. A man named Carver, out of 1st SFODD, who shot with the deliberate mechanical precision of someone who had been drilled in a very specific system and was executing it without deviation. He fired 3 rounds at measured intervals. The radio crackled from the scoring station at the far end of the canyon. "Carver, round 1, miss. Round 2, miss. Round 3, miss." Carver cleared his weapon and stepped back from the position with the controlled blankness of someone processing a result they hadn't fully believed they'd avoid. The second candidate produced the same result. The third scored a single confirmed impact on round 2, then missed rounds 1 and 3. The range fell back into silence between each string, that particular desert silence that felt like the canyon itself was paying attention. By candidate 6, a remarkably capable shooter named Diaz, who had led the cohort in standard range metrics throughout the program, the pattern had established itself. The distance, the canyon corridor, the variable wind, the combination was producing exactly the result it had produced for 32 years, which was the specific humbling of people who were very good at what they did. Diaz fired round 1. The radio crackled. Impact confirmed. A ripple of attention moved through the staging area. Round 2. The wind shifted in the canyon. Miss. Round 3. Miss. Diaz stepped back from the position. He didn't react visibly. He just walked back to the line and stood there with his arms at his sides and stared at the middle distance, and Maya thought that the look on his face was probably the closest thing to heartbreak that a person like Diaz permitted themselves in a professional setting. 7, 8, 9, 10. Patterns of miss, occasional single impacts, the cumulative evidence of a shot that was genuinely, structurally difficult. Not because of the distance alone, not because of the wind alone, but because of the specific combination of both operating inside a geography that made prediction significantly harder than standard range work. At 0831, candidate 10, Reed, stepped onto the pad. Maya checked her watch. 16 minutes to the window's opening edge, at minimum. Reed's setup was methodical, good. He got into position with the controlled efficiency she recognized from a month of watching him work. He was a genuinely excellent shooter. She had never told him that directly, which she thought now she probably should have. He fired round 1. Impact confirmed. She felt the staging area tighten around her. Reed had just done what only Diaz had done before him today, and Diaz had missed the follow-through. Reed settled. Wind flag. He made an adjustment, fired round 2. A pause. Longer than it should have been. Miss? The adjustment had been fractionally wrong. She'd seen him correct for what the flag was showing rather than for what the air inside the canyon was doing, which were two related but not identical things. She had wanted to tell him about this. She hadn't, because the knowledge was load-bearing, and the timing hadn't been right, and now it didn't matter. Round 3. He tried again. Miss? Reed cleared the weapon and stepped back. He didn't look at Maya as he walked past her. She thought he might be holding himself very carefully. Hollis called her name. Caldwell. She picked up her rifle. The pad was cold beneath her elbows when she got into position. The concrete had been in shadow since early morning and hadn't warmed yet. She adjusted her position slightly, settled the support into the natural junction of her forward hand, found her natural point of aim, and let the rifle float to where it wanted to be rather than forcing it to where she wanted it. First thing, she did not look through the scope. She looked at the canyon. She watched the near flag. The intermediate flags, there were 3 of them, spaced at 300-meter intervals along the canyon floor, barely visible in the distance. She watched the thermal behavior on the northeast rock face, which, from the firing position, required her to look past the flag line and above the target line. She watched the way the shadow line was moving on the canyon wall, tracking the sun's angle. 838. 9 minutes to the window's earliest edge, maybe 14 to the reliable center of it. She heard Hollis behind her. "Caldwell, whenever you're ready." She didn't move. 30 seconds. She was watching the intermediate flag at 600 meters. The oscillation pattern was a 7-second cycle, which was consistent with the primary canyon airflow. The secondary influence, the thermal column, would interrupt that cycle when it shifted, producing a brief period of relative stillness in the lower air before the new equilibrium established. She heard someone behind her, she didn't know who, say something quiet that she couldn't make out. The tone carried impatience or skepticism or both. Briggs said nothing. She appreciated that, or she filed it away to appreciate later when she had time. 841. 3 minutes to minimum window edge. She was lying completely still. A person could be completely still and still be doing something. Her mind was moving constantly, processing the visual data from the canyon environment, running the calculation she'd been building for 28 days, making the micro adjustments to her atmospheric model that real-time observation required. Her father had watched this canyon for 3 years and still missed his window by 3 seconds. She had watched it for 28 days and had a notebook that her father had written 28 years before that. She had advantages he hadn't. She hoped it was enough. 844. The intermediate flag at 600 meters changed, not dramatically, a slight flattening of its oscillation cycle, the secondary thermal starting to influence the lower air. She put her eye to the scope. The target resolved at the far end of the canyon, a steel plate, dark gray, barely distinguishable from the rock face behind it, until she found the specific geometry of its edges. 9 inches of strike face, 1,340 meters away. She found her breathing. Exhale halfway. Hold. The crosshairs settled. The wind in the canyon was doing something she'd calculated for and something she hadn't. The primary flow was tracking exactly as her model predicted. But there was a micro variation in the thermal column's shift, not early, not late, but with a slightly different signature than her father's notes had described. Warmer overnight temperature differential. The column was shifting with a slightly higher pressure gradient than a cooler autumn night would produce. She adjusted. 1/10 of a mil. The calculation took 3 seconds, and she did it while holding her position without breaking her respiratory cycle. 847. The flag cycle went flat. The canyon held its breath. Now, she thought, tell me where you're going. She could see it in the thermal shimmer. A reorganization, the column's influence on the lower air reaching the target line, creating the window her father had described, and she had calculated, and she had come here for. Her finger took the first stage of the trigger. The crosshairs were where they needed to be, not where she wanted them. Where the math said they needed to be, which was a different thing, a point in space that felt counterintuitive but that her calculation insisted on, and that she had learned over 11 years and 41 confirmed engagements to trust over her instincts when the math was solid. She fired. The recoil came and went. A second of silence. Then the radio at the scoring station crackled, Garza's voice. Flat, professional, without theatrical emphasis. Impact confirmed. The staging area went completely still. Not quiet. There's a difference. It went still. Like something had been paused. She did not react. She found her position again, checked the scope, assessed the thermal window. It was still open. The flat cycle was holding. She had calculated between 4 and 6 minutes of usable window at the column's center. She'd burned 40 seconds. She made no changes to her elevation or windage. The first round had told her the solution was correct. She fired again. 1 second. Impact confirmed. Behind her, someone made a sound she couldn't categorize. Not a word, just something involuntary. The kind of sound a person makes when their nervous system responds before their brain catches up. The window was still open. She could feel it in the way she could feel wind on her face. Not physically, not from inside a concrete firing position, but in the data she was reading through the scope, the thermal shimmer behavior, the flag cycle. She had 1 round left. She took 4 seconds, checked everything. The temptation was to rush. The window was open. Get the round down range before it closes. She'd seen candidates make that error all morning. Rushing because the opportunity was present was how you burned the opportunity. She slowed her heart rate by a fraction, an act of pure discipline, the product of years of practice that had made it almost mechanical. Found the natural respiratory pause. Fired. The canyon swallowed the sound of the shot the way canyons do. 2 seconds passed that felt significantly longer. The radio. Impact confirmed. 3 for 3. The window had held for all of it, and for a moment, one specific, irretrievable moment, there was nothing but silence in Ghost Canyon. Not the silence of a place waiting for something to happen. The silence of a place where something had just happened that nobody quite had the language for yet. Maya lay behind the rifle and let out a long, controlled breath. She did not stand up immediately. She lay there for 3 or 4 seconds and looked through the scope at the target she could now see was marked with 3 fresh strikes, visible even at this distance as brighter points against the dark steel. 3 rounds, 3 confirmed impacts, 32 years. She cleared the weapon, safed it, stood up, turned around. 14 faces were looking at her with expressions that existed on a spectrum she didn't have a single word for. Disbelief, recognition, something close to awe, and in some of them the specific complicated thing that happens to people when a conviction they've held firmly is suddenly and irrevocably disproven by something they witnessed with their own eyes and cannot argue with. Reed was standing with his mouth slightly open. He closed it, opened it again. 3, he said, like the number needed to be said aloud to become real. Kowalski said nothing. He just looked at her with those careful dark eyes and nodded once, slowly, and that was the entire thing. Garza's radio crackled one more time, his voice, this time with something in it that hadn't been there for any other candidate's string. Scoring station confirms 3 rounds, 3 impacts. Ghost target 7, Caldwell. He paused. First confirmed qualification, program history. The canyon returned to silence after that, and Maya stood at the edge of the firing pad with a rifle in her hands and the wind moving past her face, and she let herself have 30 seconds of it. Not triumph. She was too tired and too clear-eyed for triumph. Something quieter than that. Something that didn't have an easy name, but that felt, in the specific architecture of that moment, like a conversation with someone who could no longer speak. She had kept her promise. Then she heard footsteps on the concrete behind her, slow and deliberate, and she turned. Briggs was walking toward her across the firing pad, alone. DeLuca had stayed at his position. Garza was still at the scoring station. It was just Briggs, crossing the distance between them with the particular gait of a man who has made a decision and is carrying it in his body as he moves. He stopped 3 feet from her. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was full on his face, and she could see for the first time in 31 days what was actually there when the layers of command authority and certainty and professional composure were stripped away by something he couldn't control or revise or write questionable next to. He looked like a man standing in the wreckage of a belief he had carried for a very long time. He opened his mouth, and then his radio keyed from the scoring station, and Garza's voice came through with a transmission about equipment status, and the moment, whatever it had been about to become, broke apart into the logistics of a program day. Briggs looked at the radio, looked back at her. "Sergeant Caldwell," he said. "Sir." Something moved across his face, something she'd never seen there. He didn't complete the sentence. He turned and walked back toward the scoring station, keying his radio. Maya watched him go. Around her, the other candidates were beginning to move again, the paralysis of that communal stillness breaking up into individual motion. Someone near the back of the staging area let out a long breath that was close to a laugh and close to something else entirely. She heard Reed say something to Kowalski she couldn't make out, and Kowalski responded with something equally inaudible. She looked back at the canyon one more time. The thermal window had closed. The flags were oscillating again in their normal 7-second cycle. The northeast rock face was warming under the morning sun, already beginning to build the column that wouldn't shift again until tomorrow at roughly the same time. The canyon looked exactly as it always had. Only the target was different now. The last candidate fired 20 minutes after Maya. His name was Okoye, and he missed all 3 rounds, and nobody in the staging area reacted the way they would have reacted an hour earlier, because the conversation the program had been having with itself for 32 years had just been permanently rewritten, and everything that came after existed in a different context than everything that came before. The qualification session closed at 10:47. Hollis called the formal end, collected the scoring sheets, transmitted the final tallies to the program office via radio. Candidates were directed to return equipment to the armory and report to the main briefing room at 1300 for results processing. Maya walked the half-mile back to the main compound with her rifle case in one hand and her kit bag in the other. And she walked it alone because Reed and Kowalski had fallen in with the main group, and she'd let the gap open without closing it. Not because she was avoiding anyone, because she needed the 20 minutes of walking in the desert sun to let the morning finish settling into her. Her shoulder ached. The chronic knot from the month of sustained shooting had tightened during the firing session and was now radiating a dull complaint down the back of her arm. She rolled it once, felt the familiar resistance, let it go. The first 2 fingers of her left hand had developed their tremor again. She held the kit bag until they steadied. She was not all right in the tidy, cinematic sense. She was tired and sore and operating on 5 hours of sleep after a month of accumulated deficit, and the achievement of the morning was real, but so was the body that had produced it, and the body had opinions about the month it had just been put through. But she was standing. She was walking. She had done the things she came here to do. That would have to be enough for now. The briefing room at 1300 held 12 candidates, Briggs at the front, DeLuca to his right, Garza against the wall with a folder she recognized as the scoring documentation. The room had the specific charged quality of a space in which something significant was about to be said, and everyone in it knew it, and nobody was pretending otherwise. Briggs stood at the front for a moment without speaking. He looked at the assembled candidates the way she'd seen him look at things he was working through internally. That particular stillness that in another man might have been composure, but in him was something more effortful. Final qualification results, he said. 11 candidates did not complete Ghost Target 7. 1 candidate completed Ghost Target 7 with 3 confirmed impacts. He paused. For the first time in the program's history, he looked at Maya. Every head in the room turned. She kept her eyes on him, not defiantly, just evenly. Sergeant Caldwell's terminal qualification score, combined with her cumulative program metrics, places her first in cohort standing. Another pause, this one slightly longer than the previous ones, the kind of pause that contained something being decided in real time. By a significant margin, the room stayed quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of the first day, when her presence had created a silence nobody wanted to be responsible for. A different quality of quiet. Something closer to acknowledgement. Reed, 2 seats to her left, exhaled through his nose. She heard it. She didn't look over. Results documentation will be finalized by 1700, Briggs continued. Graduation formation is scheduled for 0800 tomorrow. Dismissed. Candidates began to move. Chairs scraped back. The organized noise of a group dispersing. Maya stood and picked up the notebook she'd brought, a habit, always having something to write in, and was heading for the door when Briggs said her name. Caldwell. Stay. She stopped. Around her the room continued emptying. Reed glanced back at her as he went through the door. She gave him nothing back, and he went. The room was empty in under a minute. Garza left last, pulling the door closed behind him. DeLuca had already gone. Just the 2 of them. Briggs moved from the front of the room and sat on the edge of the table, which was the first time she'd seen him do anything that informal. He looked at her standing in front of him and seemed to register, possibly for the first time, that she was still holding her kit bag and rifle case, that she'd come directly from the armory turn-in and hadn't had a chance to drop her gear. "Put it down," he said, nodding at the bags. She set them on the nearest chair. He looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "I owe you something," he said. She waited.
An honest conversation. He said it like it cost something, which I should have had at the beginning of this program instead of... He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. Instead of what I did. She stayed where she was, standing, not at attention, just standing, giving him the space to say what he was trying to say without making it easier or harder than it was. Walk me through the shot, he said. Ghost target 7. All of it. She looked at him. Sir? The preparation, the methodology, how you knew about the thermal window. His voice was steady, professional, but there was something underneath it that she recognized as genuine inquiry, the specific hunger of a man who has encountered something he doesn't fully understand and needs to. I've been running this program for 9 years. I've watched 112 candidates attempt that shot. None of them, not one, identified the window. She held his gaze for a moment, then she sat down in the chair nearest to her because this was going to take a while and she was very tired. My father's field notebook, she said. Something shifted in his face. He documented the Northeast thermal column behavior across 4 observation sessions during his time here as range safety officer. He identified the shift window sus. He called it a dead minute in his notes, where the primary crosswind drops out of the lower canyon air for a brief period during the column's transition. She set her hands on her knees. He attempted the shot during his own selection and missed. His notes said the column shifted with a slightly different pressure signature than he'd predicted. His timing was off by about 3 seconds. Briggs was very still. He gave me the notebook when I was 12, she said. Not because he expected me to come here, just because he wanted me to understand how he thought. She paused. I reread it when I was 22 after SOTIC. I understood it differently then, and when I got my program invitation, I spent 4 months doing atmospheric modeling on this specific canyon using historical weather station data. 4 months, Briggs repeated. The window varies by season and overnight temperature differential. I needed enough data to build a reliable prediction model. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the building, she could hear the wind moving across the desert, the sound of it against the corrugated metal of the equipment bay. Thomas Caldwell, he said finally. The name came out differently than it had before, but not as a data point, but as something heavier. Yes, sir. I knew him for 6 months. He looked at the wall to her right, not at her. He was methodical in a way I hadn't seen before, patient. He could read a range the way other people read a room. He paused. I was 22 years old, and I thought I already knew what an excellent shooter looked like. He was the first person who made me question that. She said nothing. When he left for SOTIC, I was sorry to see him go. He brought his eyes back to her. I didn't know he had a daughter. He didn't talk about family at work, she said. That was a rule he had. Family stays separate. Smart rule. He had a lot of smart rules. Something moved across Briggs's face that she still couldn't quite categorize. Not grief. He hadn't known her father well enough for grief. Something more like the belated recognition of a loss that had happened a long time ago and is only now being fully understood. I owe you more than an honest conversation, he said. I owe you a correction. He stood up from the table edge. The supplemental evaluations, the CQB assessment, the written examination, the scenario set with the data errors. He looked at her directly. None of those were standard protocol. They were... He stopped. I was looking for a reason to confirm a conclusion I'd already reached. The room held that statement. She let it sit for a moment before she spoke. I know, sir. And you documented them? Yes. All of them. Everyone. He nodded slowly. The nod of a man processing a thing he'd known was coming and had prepared for and still found harder than he'd expected. Did you intend to file them? I intended to have an accurate record. She held his gaze. What I did with it depended on what the program did. He understood that. She could see him understanding it, the leverage it represented, the restraint its non-use represented, and what both of those things together said about the person sitting across from him. The record will be corrected, he said. All supplemental assessments marked as non-standard, with notations removing any implied performance deficiency.
Your evaluation file will reflect your actual standing, which is—" He paused, and the pause had a different quality than his earlier pauses. "Exceptional, without qualification." She let out a breath through her nose. Not a sigh, just a small release of something she'd been holding for a month. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me for doing what I should have done on day one." She looked at him. "I'm not. I'm thanking you for doing it now." A beat. "It's not nothing." He held her gaze. She thought she saw something in him shift. Small, tectonic, the kind of movement that doesn't show on the surface but changes the underlying structure of things. "Is there anything else you want to say to me, Sergeant?" She thought about that. There were things she could say. She'd had a month to build a list, and the list was not short, and some of the items on it were sharp enough to draw blood. She had earned the right to most of them. "One thing," she said. "Say it. Don't just be sorry." She met his eyes. "Be different." The silence that followed was long enough to be uncomfortable, and she didn't fill it. Briggs nodded once. Dismissed. She picked up her gear and walked out. But that afternoon, the desert did what deserts do in late afternoon. It turned the light to copper and made everything it touched look slightly more significant than it probably was. Maya sat outside the barracks on a concrete step, with her back against the wall and her face tilted toward the sun, and let herself be still for 20 minutes, which was the first genuine stillness she'd had since she arrived. Reed found her there at around 15:30. He sat down on the step next to her without asking. The kind of thing you do with someone after a month in a high-pressure environment has worn away the social formalities. He had 2 cans of cold Coke, which in the Black Ridge mess was a minor miracle of procurement that she didn't ask about. He handed her one. She took it. They sat in the copper light and didn't say anything for a while, which was its own kind of communication. 3, he said eventually. "Yeah. I had one and I thought—" He stopped, shook his head. "I thought that was going to be enough." "One is incredible," she said. "Nobody's done one in 13 years. You did 3. Different preparation." He looked at her. "You knew about the window." She glanced over. "How long have you known that?" "Since last night, when you were studying the forecast data and you had that look." He held up a hand before she could respond. "I don't care that you didn't tell me. I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just—" He considered his words. "I'm trying to understand how you think." She looked back at the desert. "My father spent 3 years studying that canyon. He wrote everything down. I had his notes." Reed processed this. "He was here?" "Range safety officer, before SOTIC." She took a drink of the Coke. "He attempted the shot during his own selection. Missed." A pause. "And you came here to finish what he started." She said it simply, without drama. "Among other things." Reed was quiet for a moment. She could see him putting pieces together. The worn notebook she always had, the specific, almost personal quality of her preparation for the canyon, the way she'd looked in that 30-second stillness after the 3rd confirmed impact. "What happened to him?" he asked. "Mosul, 2011. "I'm sorry." "Me too." She finished the Coke. "He would have liked you, I think. You ask decent questions." Reed smiled at that, the small, real smile of someone who's received a compliment they weren't expecting and doesn't know quite what to do with it. "High praise from you." "You know how much I talk. Take what you can get." He laughed. The real one, the kind she'd heard from him before, surprised and unguarded. And she realized that she would miss this, the particular chemistry of this group in this place, which was a thing she hadn't anticipated when she arrived. She hadn't arrived expecting to find people she'd miss. Kowalski came to her room that evening. He knocked. She opened the door. He was holding a piece of paper. She recognized the format as a program internal document, one of the evaluation summary sheets. "You need to see this," he said. She took it. It was her program evaluation file summary, the version that got posted for official record. She read down the page. The supplemental assessments were there, each flagged with a notation she hadn't expected to see rendered in actual program language. Non-standard supplemental evaluation. Results excluded from candidate standing calculation per command review. Authorized by CO, Colonel N. Briggs. Every one of them, dated today. She read it twice. Then she handed it back to Kowalski. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "DeLuca." He held it between them. He posted it on the evaluation board. All candidate files are posted before graduation. This one got... He searched for the word. Attention. From who? From everyone. He paused. Seeing it laid out like that, the number of additional evaluations, the pattern of them, he looked at her steadily. People counted, Maya. It was the first time he'd used her first name. She didn't respond for a moment. And I think you should know that what Briggs did in that file today, correcting it publicly in the official record before graduation, is not a thing I expected from him. He folded the paper carefully. It doesn't fix the month you just had. No. But it's something. I know, she said. I told him that. Kowalski looked at her with the same careful, undemonstrative regard she'd come to understand over the past weeks. He wasn't good at warmth in the conventional sense. He expressed care in the precise, practical way of someone who had grown up in an environment where precision was the primary language. You were the best shooter in this cohort, he said. By a distance. You know that. I know what my scores were. I'm not talking about scores. He held her gaze. I watched how you moved through this program for a month, not just on the range, in the classroom, in the field exercises, in the debriefs. You don't perform well. You just operate at a level and let the level be what it is. He paused. I've been in a lot of selection environments. I've been around a lot of operators. I've never seen someone manage a hostile command structure with that much discipline while simultaneously leading the peer group without anyone realizing they were being led. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't trying to lead anyone. I know, he said. That's what made it work. She leaned against the doorframe. The compound outside was settling into its evening sounds. The distant generator, the flag snapping in the cooling air, the murmur of other candidates in other rooms doing what people do on the night before graduation when the worst of it is over. You're a strange man to have met in this situation, she said. Kowalski almost smiled. It was the most expressive she'd seen his face. Likewise, Caldwell. He held out the evaluation summary. She took it this time, folded it once, and put it in her pocket. After he left, she sat at her desk and wrote in her log. Date, time, the correction of her file, the conversation with Briggs, the notation of what he'd said and what she'd said back. She wrote it in the same careful, factual prose she always used without editorializing. Just the record. She had 32 logs in total now. Every additional evaluation, every irregular assignment, every instance of instruction that deviated from standard protocol applied to other candidates. She would not file them. She closed the log and put it in the bottom of her bag, next to her father's notebook. 2 documents. One that recorded what had been done to her, and one that recorded what had been done before her. Her father's attempt, his miss, his 3 years of careful observation. Together they made a kind of archive that she hadn't planned and couldn't have anticipated. She turned off the desk lamp. In the dark, she thought about what Briggs had looked like when she'd said, "Don't just be sorry, be different." The specific quality of stillness that had followed. She had not said it to wound him. She'd said it because she meant it, because the correction of a record was the beginning of something and not the end of it. And she wanted him to understand the difference. Whether he did was something she wouldn't know for certain from this side of tomorrow. She lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling she'd been looking at for 32 nights. And she thought that the ceiling looked exactly the same as it had always looked, and that she was looking at it from a completely different position than she had been a month ago, and that both of those things were simultaneously true, which was the way it almost always was with things that actually mattered. Outside, the desert did what it always did, swallowed the light, went enormous and dark and silent. She closed her eyes. In the morning, there would be a formation and a ceremony, and a colonel standing in front of 12 candidates saying things that would be recorded and filed and that would exist as official language in the program's permanent history. And the thing that existed before the ceremony, the 32 days, the logs, the extra evaluations, the shot, the window, the notebook, The word questionable written in the margin of a performance that was anything but. That would exist too, in a different register, in the way that the real things always exist alongside the official record of them. She slept. She didn't dream. Or if she did, she didn't remember it when she woke at 400 to the desert dark, and the sound of the wind moving through the canyon she could not see, but had come to know as well as anything she'd ever studied in her life, and lay still for a moment in the last quiet before the last day, and thought about her father, and thought about the shot, and thought that 11 centimeters across 28 years was not very far at all. She was dressed and standing outside before the compound lights came on. It looked different in the dark before graduation than it had in the dark before day one. Same buildings, same chain link, same flag going quiet in the pre-dawn stillness. But the way she saw it had changed in the specific way that places change when you've done something in them that you can't undo. When the geography has absorbed something of what you went through and given something back that it didn't have before you arrived. She was sore. Her shoulder was still complaining. The tremor in her left fingers had resolved overnight, but would be back if she sat at a desk too long or let the cold get into the joint. She had a stress fracture in her right foot that she'd self-diagnosed around day 18 and hadn't told anyone about, managing it with athletic tape and deliberate load distribution in a way that had cost her more energy than she would have liked. The fracture would need imaging when she got back to Bragg. It would heal. She was not in perfect condition. She had not been in perfect condition for most of the month. She had produced exceptional work from an imperfect condition using the full architecture of what she'd built over 34 years, and that was the honest accounting of it. She stood in the dark and let the honest accounting sit with her for a while. Then she went back inside and made coffee and reviewed her out-processing checklist and got ready for graduation. Tets. The formation assembled at 0750 in the main courtyard. 11 candidates stood in a single rank. Okoye had been formally notified at 0630 that his terminal qualification score fell below the completion threshold, making his the last of 6 elimination decisions from the final cohort of 12. He had shaken hands with the people he wanted to shake hands with and loaded his gear into a vehicle and left with a dignity that Maya respected. She had shaken his hand last and told him the canyon was a hard problem and that his single confirmed impact at 1,100 meters was a number most people in any program would be proud of, and he had looked at her with the flat, composed expression of a man who was not going to discuss his feelings in a military courtyard and said, "Thank you," and that was that. 11 candidates. The sky above the courtyard was bright California desert blue, the overnight cold already starting to release under the low morning sun. The flag was up and moving. The facility staff occupied a position to the right of the formation. DeLuca, Garza, Hollis, 4 others whose names she'd cataloged but not learned well. Briggs stood at the front. He looked exactly as he always looked. The composure was intact, the posture, the contained authority of a man who commanded spaces by existing in them. But she had been watching him for 32 days, and she could read what was underneath the composure in a way she couldn't at the beginning, the same way she'd learned to read the canyon, not the surface presentation but the structural movement beneath it. He was carrying something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the slight forward weight of his posture. Something he'd been carrying since the conversation in the briefing room, and probably since before that, if she was being honest about it. He began speaking in the direct, unornamented way he conducted everything. Program completion acknowledgement, candidate performance summary, the administrative language of certification and official record. He read through it with the competence of long practice. Then he stopped. He looked down at the papers in his hand for a moment. It was a brief pause, 3, maybe 4 seconds. But in a military formation where everything moves on schedule, 3 seconds is a significant amount of time. He looked up. Before I proceed to individual recognition, I need to say something that isn't on this page. His voice was the same, controlled even, but the quality of the room had changed with those 8 words in the way a room changes when someone decides to say a real thing. During this selection cycle, I made decisions that were inconsistent with the standards this program is supposed to uphold. He wasn't looking at Maya specifically. He was addressing the formation, all 11 of them, and the staff to his right. I applied additional evaluations to one candidate that were not applied to others, for reasons that had nothing to do with that candidate's qualifications or performance, and everything to do with my own assumptions. He paused. The candidate's official file has been corrected to reflect her actual standing, which is first in cohort by a significant margin. But I want it said in formation, in front of everyone present, because a private correction doesn't account for what was done publicly. The courtyard was very quiet. Sergeant Maya Caldwell is the highest performing candidate this program has seen in over a decade. She is also the first person in 32 years to complete Ghost Target 7, which she accomplished with 3 confirmed impacts in a single firing session using preparation and methodology that none of us who've been running this range had thought to apply. He looked at her now. What I decided about her before she arrived was wrong. What I attempted to do about it during the program was wrong. The record reflects that. I wanted the people in this formation to hear me say it. She stood in the rank and looked straight ahead and kept her breathing steady. Reed, 2 positions to her left, was very still. Kowalski, 1 position to her right, didn't move. Briggs held her gaze for a moment after he finished speaking. She gave him a single, brief nod. Not submission, acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of something difficult that had been done, imperfectly but genuinely. He nodded back. Then he continued with the ceremony. The certificates were presented in cohort ranking order, which meant Maya went last. When she stepped forward to receive it, Briggs held out the certificate and then, before she could take it, extended his right hand. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, then took it. His grip was firm and brief and said something about the distance between day 1 and this moment that neither of them had language for. She walked back to her position in the rank. The paper in her hand was heavy stock, program seal at the top, her name in the center, the certification language below that. At the bottom, in the field that read Evaluating Officer's Notation, someone had typed 3 lines that weren't standard program language. She read them once during the walk back to her position. Candidate demonstrated exceptional precision methodology and environmental analysis throughout selection. Ghost Target 7 completion, program record, first in cohort. N. Briggs, Colonel. She folded it once and held it at her side. After the formation broke, the courtyard went to the comfortable chaos of out-processing. Handshakes, vehicle coordination, the process of a month's accumulation of gear and records being organized for departure. The staff began moving through administrative details. Candidates clustered in the loose, relieved way of people who had been through something together and were beginning the process of understanding what it meant. Reed appeared at her left shoulder. "I heard what he said," he said. "So did I." "How do you feel?" She thought about that honestly. "Like I need about a week of uninterrupted sleep and an imaging appointment for my foot." He blinked. "Your foot?" "Stress fracture, around day 18. You ran the 5-milers with a stress fracture." I ran everything with a stress fracture." He stared at her. "Maya, it's manageable." "That is..." He stopped. "I don't know what that is." "It's what you do when elimination is the alternative." She looked at him. "Don't tell me you wouldn't have done the same." He opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer was yes, and they both knew it. He let it go. "What happens now?" he asked. "For you, after Bragg." She had been thinking about this. She had a return flight on Friday, a medical appointment she'd need to schedule, a unit to report back to, a desk full of whatever had accumulated in her absence. Life, in other words, had continued existing outside Black Ridge for the past 32 days and was waiting to reassert itself. "I go back," she said. "Do my job." "And this?" He gestured vaguely at the compound, the program, the canyon visible in the distance past the western fence line. "This is part of the record now." She looked at the canyon. "Both records." He followed her gaze. "Both?" "Mine. And my father's." She paused. "He started something here. I finished it." Reed was quiet for a moment. She thought he was going to say something sentimental, and she was trying to decide in advance how to handle it. But what he said was, "The thermal window, you knew about it because of his notes." "Yes." "Will you write it up, formally, the methodology?" She looked at him. It hadn't occurred to her, which was unusual because most things she thought through from multiple angles before they happened. She'd been so focused on the doing of it,
that the documentation afterward had been an abstraction. If the program would use it, she said, Briggs would use it. Reed said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had revised his assessment of a person based on recent evidence. You heard him this morning. She had heard him. She was still processing what she'd heard, not the public acknowledgement, which was significant but not the whole of it, but the specific sentence about his sister Margaret that he hadn't said yet. That was still coming. She didn't know how she knew that. She just did. And she was loading her duffel into the transport vehicle at 11:30 when Briggs found her. He came across the parking area with the deliberate walk of a man who has decided to do something and is committed to it before he arrives. He stopped at a distance that was more personal than professional, closer than command distance, not as close as anything else. The specific geometry of two people who have been through something difficult and don't have a framework for it. I'd like a few minutes, he said. She set the duffel down. I have about 20. They walked to the edge of the parking area where the desert started, past the last row of vehicles, to a place where the compound sounds receded enough to have a conversation that wasn't a performance. He looked at the canyon, then at her. I had a sister, he said. Margaret. She waited. She applied to a selection program similar to this one, 26 years ago. Different facility, same structure. He kept his eyes on the horizon. She lasted 3 weeks. She didn't fail any evaluation. She left because every authority figure in that environment had decided before she arrived that her presence was an error. They made the program uninhabitable for her in ways that were never written down. He paused. She's an ER physician in Phoenix now. She's exceptional at what she does. She has been, her whole life. Maya said nothing. I spent a long time telling myself that I was protecting people, that what I was doing was preserving the integrity of programs like this one, that standards were standards and my judgment about who could meet them was sound. He turned and looked at her directly. I watched you for 32 days. I know what I was doing, what I was. I was doing exactly what was done to Margaret, and I was calling it something else. The desert wind moved between them, dry and thin and clean. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because you deserve to know why. He held her gaze. Not what I did. You already knew that. Why? She looked at him for a long moment. He was a hard man to read and always had been, but she'd been doing it for a month and she understood the texture of what he was showing her right now. It wasn't performance. It was the labored honesty of a man who had held a belief for decades and had watched it collapse under the weight of something he couldn't argue with, and who was standing in the wreckage without a map. Does Margaret know? She asked. He blinked. It wasn't the question he'd expected. Does she know that I've been running a program the same way she was treated? He was quiet for a moment. No. You should tell her. He looked at her. Not because she needs to hear it, Maya said, because you need to say it to the right person. She paused. I'm not the right person. She is. Briggs absorbed this. She watched him absorb it. The slight tension in his jaw, the small, involuntary movement of a man encountering a truth he hadn't anticipated in the shape he encountered it. What will you do with the methodology? He said after a moment. The thermal window analysis, your father's notes. Write it up, she said, if the program will use it. I want it in the curriculum. He said it without hesitation, which told her he'd already been thinking about it. Not just the ghost target approach, the full environmental reading methodology you were teaching the cohort in the debriefs. I wasn't formally teaching anything. I know what I watched happen in those evening sessions. He met her eyes. 9 candidates performed measurably better in the final 2 weeks of this program than their trajectory in the first 2 weeks predicted. That doesn't happen by accident. She said nothing. I'd like you to come back, he said. Not as a candidate, as an instructor contributor. Temporary duty, 2 weeks, next selection cycle. Work with my training staff on incorporating what you were doing informally into formal curriculum. She looked at him. You're asking me to come back to a program you spent 32 days trying to push me out of. Yes. He didn't flinch from it. I am. Why would I do that? Because you told me not to just be sorry. He held her gaze. Being different means changing what this program produces. I can mandate procedure all I want, but I can't do what you do in a room with 11 other people by writing a policy document. He paused. You can, and the candidates who come through here after this will be better because of it. That matters to you. I've been watching you for a month. It matters to you. She looked at the canyon in the distance, the canyon that her father had studied for 3 years and documented in a small worn notebook that she'd carried across 2 deployments and a month of hostile selection. The canyon that had a shot in it that nobody had made for 32 years, including him. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm asking. She looked back at him. There's one condition, non-negotiable. Name it. The evaluation standards are identical for every candidate. Written, published, auditable. No supplemental assessments. No discretionary additions that aren't applied uniformly. She held his eyes. If I'm going to put my name on what this program teaches, the program has to be worth putting my name on. He was quiet for exactly the length of time it took to understand that she meant it completely, and that there was no room for negotiation on the substance, only on the details. Agreed, he said. She nodded once. I'll think about it. Cheb. The transport vehicle left Black Ridge at 1300. Maya sat in the same seat she'd occupied on the inbound bus. Back, window, the desert scrolling past in the afternoon light that was the inverse of what it had been at 4 a.m. 32 days ago. Different light, different direction. Kowalski sat across the aisle. He'd said almost nothing during the out-processing, which was consistent with how he said almost nothing in most situations, and she'd respected it the way he'd respected her silences all month. An hour outside the facility, he spoke. You're going to go back, he said. Not a question. She looked over. Why do you think that? Because you spent your whole life building toward this place and you're not done with it yet. He looked out his own window. And because the shot is one thing, what you do after it is what defines you. She considered that. My father used to say something similar. Smart man. Yeah. Reed was in the front of the vehicle, already asleep against the window, with the spectacular unconscious efficiency of someone whose body had been waiting for permission. She looked at him for a moment. This young, capable, well-meaning man who had knocked on her door with 2 cups of black coffee and said I think it was bullshit and meant it, and who had asked her decent questions all month and listened to the answers. She thought about what Kowalski had said during the final week. You're not just clearing the bars, you're making the rest of us clear them differently. She hadn't been trying to do that. She'd been trying to do her own job well enough to be impossible to dismiss. But the thing had happened anyway, in the way that real things happen, not as strategy, but as consequence. Her father had known this. He'd built it into everything he taught her, the way a structure's load-bearing capacity is built into the material itself rather than applied to the surface. The best thing a shooter can do isn't the shot. It's helping the shooter next to them understand the wind. She reached into her bag and took out the worn brown envelope, slid out the photograph. Her father squinting into sunlight, holding the .308. The look on his face that she'd spent 20 years learning to read. That particular combination of patience and attention that was the signature of everything he'd ever taught her. She looked at it for a while. Then she looked out the window at the desert going past, the canyon already invisible behind them, already distance, already becoming the kind of memory that becomes more specific rather than less as time passes. She thought about what she'd write in the methodology document, the thermal column analysis, the historical weather data, the observation protocol her father had started and she'd completed, the specific calculation that had produced 3 impacts where 32 years had produced at most 1. She thought about how to write it so it was useful rather than impressive. Not the story of what she'd done, but the tool that someone else could pick up and use. She thought about the candidates who would come through Black Ridge next cycle, and the cycle after that, and what it would mean if the program they arrived at was genuinely, structurally different from the one she'd arrived at. If the evaluation standards were published and identical and auditable. If the thermal window methodology was in the curriculum. If the question of whether someone belonged was answered by what they could do rather than by what a man with power had decided before he watched them do anything. She thought about Margaret Briggs in Phoenix, who was exceptional at what she did and always had been. She would go back. She'd known it when Briggs asked, known it before she said she'd think about it. The thinking about it was real.
She would think about it carefully and thoroughly, the way she thought about everything. But the conclusion was already there. Not for Briggs, not even entirely for the future candidates, though that mattered. For her father, partly. Because he had studied that canyon for 3 years and never gotten back to it, and she had finished what he started, and the finishing deserved to extend beyond a single firing session, deserved to become something that carried forward. And for herself. Because she had spent 11 years proving she could operate at a level that couldn't be dismissed, and that proof was complete. And what came after a completed proof was the question of what you built with it. You could leave. You could take the certification and the record and the knowledge that you had done an impossible thing under hostile conditions, and you could walk away from the place that had tried to break you, and that would be a reasonable and defensible choice. Or you could go back, not as the person who'd been trying to survive, as the person who had something to teach. Those were different positions to occupy. They required different things from her. She knew which one her father would have recognized. She returned to Ghost Canyon one more time before her flight. She asked Reed to cover for her absence at the group dinner. He didn't ask why, just said fine in the easy way he had when he'd decided to trust someone, and drove the rental car back to the facility's outer perimeter as the sun was dropping behind the western ridge and the desert was doing its evening transition into the enormous copper and violet quiet. The facility was in reduced manning. The main gate attended by a single MP who checked her temporary access credential and waved her through without ceremony. She parked at the range road entrance and walked the half-mile to the canyon on foot. The gate to Ghost Canyon was unlocked. The range safety flag was down. She walked through it and along the canyon floor to the firing position shelf and stood where she'd been standing 12 hours earlier when the radio had said first confirmed qualification. Program history. The canyon was different in the evening light. The northeast rock face had gone from the tawny gold of the day to something deeper and more shadowed, and the thermal column that had been the mechanism of everything was long settled, the air in the canyon still and cool, and carrying the specific mineral smell of desert rock releasing its stored heat. She stood there for a while. She took the photograph from her jacket pocket. Thomas Caldwell. Squinting into sunlight. The .308 across his forearms, the look on his face that she now understood was the look of a man who has just shown his daughter something she's going to spend the rest of her life using. She had driven out here thinking she would say something. Now that she was here, she understood that there was nothing to say that the morning hadn't already said. The canyon knew. The target at 1,340 meters knew. The scoring sheet with 3 confirmation marks knew. He would have laughed at her gently for coming back out here to have a moment. He wasn't a sentimental man in the obvious ways. He just took people to places and showed them things and trusted them to understand what they were looking at. She had understood. Eventually. Across 34 years and 2 deployments and 11 of his careful, specific lessons and 1 worn notebook and 1 morning in a desert canyon where the air had gone still for exactly the right length of time. She put the photograph back in her pocket, turned and walked back out of the canyon. The drive to Las Vegas took 2.5 hours. Reed called twice, once to make sure she was coming back, once to tell her that Kowalski had ordered enough pizza for 8 people and was pretending it was for the group when it was very clearly for himself. She told him she'd be there in an hour. He said Kowalski had already eaten 4 slices in 30 seconds. She told him that tracked. She drove through the Nevada desert in the last of the evening light, with the window down and the dry air coming through and the radio off, and she thought about what she was going to write in the methodology document, and what she was going to tell her unit when she got back to Bragg, and when she was going to call Briggs to tell him she'd come back for the next cycle. She thought about all the people who would come through that program in the years ahead, men and women arriving with their duffel bags, and their preparation, and their whole careers of evidence that they were exactly who they said they were, and what it would mean if the thing that had happened to her didn't happen to them. If the evaluation was what it was supposed to be. If the shot was what defined you, not the assumptions of the person watching. She didn't know if Briggs would keep his word. She thought he would. She thought the conversation in the parking area had been the most honest thing he'd said in 9 years, and she thought the honesty of it had cost him enough that it would hold. She thought a man standing in the wreckage of a belief he'd carried for decades, choosing to say what he'd said in that formation in front of everyone,
was a man who had moved past the point where going back was available to him. But she would verify it. She would verify everything, methodically and completely, the way her father had taught her to verify wind. Not because you don't trust the flag, but because the flag is only one source and the air is the actual thing, and you need both. She would go back. She would write the document. She would teach the window. And in some future selection cycle, in some future morning, some candidate she'd never met would lie behind a rifle on a concrete shelf and watch the northeast thermal column shift and know what to do with what they were seeing, because the knowledge that had lived in her father's notebook and her own preparation would by then live in the curriculum of the program, unremarkable, available, just something you learned. That was the shot that kept going after you fired it. That was the one that mattered most. She pulled into the hotel parking lot at 9:47 p.m. Reed was waiting outside with a slice of pizza on a paper plate, which he handed to her without comment when she got out of the car. She took it. "Kowalski?" she asked, currently pretending he didn't eat 6 slices. How many did he eat? 8. She almost smiled. "Come on." They walked inside. The greatest victories are not the records you break or the barriers you move through alone. They are the doors you make sure stay open after you.